Welcome to New Thinking for a New World, a Telberg Foundation podcast. I am Alan Stoga, your host. Each week, I bring you conversations with people who think differently about the great issues that are shaping our world. Geopolitics, disruptive tech, mass migration, the changing climate, culture wars, all of it is grist for our mill. I hope you enjoy listening. I also hope you will let me know what you think and that you join the conversation at telbergfoundation.org. And now for today's episode of New Thinking for a New World. I want to start today's podcast with three propositions. First, democracy is under dire pressure in most countries. I think most people would agree with that, although I suspect there would be considerable disagreement over who's at fault and what's at risk. Second, good journalism, deeply sourced, unbiased reporting of facts in the pursuit of truth, is an endangered species in many countries. Again, probably much disagreement about what is bias, what are facts, and whose truth. Third, technology is an enabler as well as a frustrator of both democracy and good journalism. AI, social media, and the internet are transformative, for better and for worse. Information is competing with disinformation like never before to shape our democracies and our lives. The intersection of democracy, journalism, and technology is an incredibly important but also contentious space. This is exactly where my guest on this episode of New Thinking for a New World lives and operates. María Teresa Ronderos is an accomplished Colombian investigative journalist and co-founder of the Latin American Center for Investigative Journalism. Welcome, María Teresa.
Hey, thank you very much, Alan. It's a pleasure to be here.
As you well know, 2024 has been the year of elections. Something like half of the people on the planet have had or will have the opportunity to vote in regional, national, or local elections. In the Americas alone, it's El Salvador, Panama, Dominican Republic, Mexico, Venezuela, Uruguay, and soon the United States have had or are having general elections. Brazil and Chile have important municipal elections, and the Argentines voted at the end of last year. What is the role of journalists in this massive democratic process, good, bad, or ugly?
I think the journalists have to tell the story, tell people what's happening, what's going on. And also they have to navigate right now in this massive disinformation, in this massive attempt to confuse people, to frighten people. There's several actors right now as we speak in these elections. We've been doing a lot of research on that. And a lot of these actors are trying to propagate false information. Not the old way it used to happen. It's always been like that in the elections. You know, people lie because they want to get ahead and win the election. But this is different because this is disguised as if it came from the people. The most problematic thing about what's happening today in the information sphere is that people don't know they're being deceived. It's not like, there is, like probably in Venezuela, people knew they were being deceived by the government. But in other places, you feel it's like somebody else, your neighbor, your friend, anybody in the chat. They're telling you what they think. They share with you supposed good information. So the role of journalism is to verify, double verify, and also to learn about technology and how this information spreads. That's a new challenge for journalists. You're not telling the public who and how and when. They could be disinformed. They could be misled. False majorities are created in the online sphere, then people will be completely confused. I think that's super key. That the other thing that I think journalists should do is follow the money at the old journalism, especially during elections, because a lot of the money is hidden. It's not obvious who is financing what, who are the powers behind many of these candidates that are not very legitimate. And I think that's something super important also for journalists to follow. In some of the countries, of Latin America, unfortunately, like my own country, Colombia, you should also be very much aware of violence. How is violence putting pressure on politics? How is violence forbidding some candidates to run and pushing and pressuring on promoting some other candidates through the worst possible ways, which is through violence? And that you also have to be very much aware as a journalist.
I want to pull on a number of threads hanging from that ball. I want to talk a bit about information and disinformation and about technology. But let me start elsewhere. Let me start with bias. You have a well-deserved reputation as a courageous, honest, thoughtful, determined journalist, which you've developed that reputation over decades. But we also now, and this isn't you, it's others, live in a world where we have something called advocacy journalism, where journalists have decided that they ought to have a bias. That bias ought to inform their work. And not just journalists, but media companies, both the individuals and the collective. And they seem typically, not surprisingly, or often at least, to define themselves in terms of resistance. I remember when Trump was first elected, the Guardian newspaper declared itself the mouthpiece of the resistance, which struck me as a very peculiar position for a journalist, for a newspaper, for a media outlet. We all have biases by definition. But I would hope that journalism doesn't, or good journalism doesn't. Is that wrong?
No, I totally agree with you. I believe that the only thing that makes journalism unique, and the only reason why society should protect journalists, it's because they at least have a methodology developed over, I would say, decades on how to verify and how to make sure you enter into a problem and you really check on your own biases. Of course, you have biases, but then you have to report against those biases. You have to make sure that you are trying to get us closer to a possible truth of what happened or why things happened or what's the complexity of the situation. And I think that's what defines journalism, because today in the craziness of internet, everybody has opinions, everybody has information, everybody puts up things. There's tons of advocates and tons of people cheerleading for this or that, or this position or the other position. What's missing is good information that people can rely on. And I think that's the big difference between journalism and what they call advocacy journalism, which is not really journalism. And I have a lot of respect for activists. Yeah, they're great. We can even work together sometimes with activists if they're honest and they're doing a great activism. But they enter into a problem to promote a view of the world. They want an outcome. No? If I'm studying, I don't know, spilling of oil or climate change, and I'm an activist, I want to prove that there are problems with climate change. I want to prove and show that. If I'm a journalist, I come in and I see, what do I find? I don't have an answer. I just go and verify and use my method. And now with the new technology and the open source journalism investigation, you can really verify very deeply what you're trying to say or find. And then you find what you find. And if you find there's not a manifestation of, let's say, climate change in that particular country or people there specifically, they're not affected, you're going to say it. It's not. That's the promise that journalism sells to society, and it should deliver, because otherwise we're going to be all completely lost.
And I've got to confess that I think we are more lost than found in that respect, because too many journalists have become advocates, maybe not first, but they become advocates. And that bias, unfortunately, infects too often the good journalism that's done, because if you're used to reading bias, you sort of assume bias. And to put that into a question, I've been wondering whether it is the movement online, as all media you may still print copies of physical newspapers, but you also have an online presence. And so the infection of the confusion online seems, but I should ask a question, is that a cause of this advocacy journalism stuff, which destroys good journalism?
I think yes, but I think there's also another phenomenon, which is populist journalism. People want to be popular. They want to have and because the whole system is set up like that in the internet. You want to have 100 likes. You want to have 2,000 to 20,000 followers. I always kid because I have 22,000 followers in Twitter and I never tweet anything. Never, And I say, what are they following? I don't know what they're following. I mean, before I used to tweet just the link of my columns or of a story, but that's all. I don't give any opinions or anything, And because that's my discipline as an investigative reporter. And then I say, but people follow you. It's like a fan club. I don't know what it is. But I was hearing in a conference, I was a migration journalism conference, which was fascinating in Spain just last week. One of the colleagues was saying, I don't want journalists are losing themselves because they want to be popular first than anything else. And you have to be unpopular. So you have this team in El Salvador, which is called El Faro. It's a media outlet that's very courageous and one of the first early movers to the internet. And they're highly unpopular because they're checking on the government, which is very popular, a very authoritarian, populist government as Bukele's, and they are doing their job. So they're very unpopular with people because people say, why don't you help the government? You should be helping the government. And that's something that a lot of journalists don't want to be. They don't want to say things that are unpopular. And the internet is ruled by popularity. Everybody wants cheer and crowd, thousands of followers.
One of the unfortunate consequences of that, if I could connect a dot, is that increasingly in many countries, people don't trust journalists. They don't trust anybody else either, but journalists and government officials in the recent Edelman polling, which they do year after year after year on trust, are equally distrusted, which is a tragedy because, well, we need both, but we certainly need trustworthy and trusted journalists. How do you regain trust if not you as a journalist, if journalism is less trusted today? That feeds into our distrust of democracy and everything else. How do we break that cycle of distrust?
I think there is a huge challenge because you have to put yourself in the shoes of the people who don't believe you. And then when you write or tell a story or present a video or whatever, try to say, how do I engage them? How do I include them? So there's a little bit of preachiness and high moral ground that just puts people off. When journalists say, oh, I'm better than everybody else, they just don't want to hear them. So I think there is a need to try to understand much better those who are critical. And I think one of the ways which we have found is to join forces. If there are media outlets from different countries doing collaborative work like we do in CLIP, and they come up with a story, we believe that there is a higher chance that people believe us because they will say, oh, these are people from different political tendencies, from different countries, and they're publishing together. So probably it means that this is more trustworthy content, let's say. And I think that's something that's a way to build trust. The other way is use the internet to create communities. You have to create communities along, and not just to get subscriptions. So it's not just to get money. It's communities of trust because you have to be aware that you're no longer just in your high mountain telling everybody what's happening, but you have to reach out to people so they can also include their truths, their knowledge. We have incredibly, amazingly knowledgeable audiences, and we don't use any of their knowledge. And we need to include them in the conversation and produce that information together. And I think that's super important for people to trust, because if you're being consulted and you know how the sausage was made, then you are willing to eat the sausage. If you don't know, that's more complicated.
You mentioned CLIP, which is the Latin American Center for Investigative Journalism, of which you are a co-founder. And my understanding of CLIP, a bit like ProPublica in the United States, and there's others like it that are doing cooperative journalism outside any media title. So they're not owned by media companies. In most cases, as I understand it, they're nonprofits or they're funded by nonprofits. And the idea is to do good journalism, trying to erase that potential for bias and trusting in the marketplace to buy the product, I guess. That's a new phenomenon in the last several years. Is it a better way to do journalism, do you think, in the 21st century?
I think it is. I think it is because you have a commodity that all of a sudden, which is information, became completely massive. No, we don't have scarcity of information. We have tons of information. Now, good information is scarce. It's still scarce. It's still difficult. So why compete when there's so many people producing information? You need to collaborate. I think that the logic of the new marketplace is you need to collaborate. Collaborate because you need to fight all of this mess of disinformation, and you need to stand out and you have a better chance to be seen if you publish together in 5 countries with these big stories. I think you have a much better chance of being believed, as I said. And another thing that has haunted me all my profession, which is people feel very lonely. Journalists feel very lonely at this time and age. People, they don't have a newsroom like they used to. They have very tiny little newsrooms, or they have a big newsroom which is constantly saying they have no money for anything. They don't have support, not technology, nor legal, nor anything. And also they face incredible dangers. We see the figures of the Committee to Protect Journalists going up and up and up every year, of journalists being attacked, harassed, put in prison, etc. So how do you go on? The only way is to join forces. And that's what we thought a lot about CLIP, that we could have this network in which people don't feel so lonely. They feel they have colleagues. They feel they can transcend whatever impediments they have in their own country or the dangers they're facing. And they feel braver and more courageous. We all feel much better when we work together. And beyond the country, then we also are able to get information that sometimes it's impossible to get in the country. So sometimes there's a terrible company doing something in your country, contaminating or doing bribery, and you can get more information in the US or the UK or wherever this company has to file their financial records or whatever. Maybe you can get more information there than you can get in your own country, because access of information is also closing with this threat to democracy.
What do War Lessons from Gaza, Rethinking Education, Peace in Ukraine and Visionary Leadership have in common? They are all themes from recent episodes of this podcast. Check out more episodes on talbergfoundation.org or on a platform of your choice.
You mentioned the money problem. So let's talk about money a little bit. One of the things that the internet has trained people to do is to not pay for information, not pay for analysis. You can get almost anything you want online, you think, and you get it free. And then along comes CLIP, or along comes ProPublica, or along comes the New York Times and says, no, this is good information. This is better information. You should pay for this. And people say, nah, I don't think so. I can get it free over there. So weirdly, it seems to me that phenomenon, the internet, is destroying good journalism, or at least is a major impediment, a huge rock on the road that you've got to maneuver around. Now, Clip has found some ways around it, but how do you sustain good journalism economically in this world?
Well, right now, I believe that there is all these donations and foundations that believe in journalism and believe because democracy is under fire, they should support journalism. And good quality journalism takes time and takes a lot of work and sometimes resources and technical resources. So I do think that that's a very good source of income for all these media outlets, ProPublica, or not the New York Times, but us and a lot of our colleagues. And also the other thing is that you don't have to lose your entrepreneurial spirit. I always believe that you have to find a way to make money also. And so what we do is we do trainings, we do develop technology for others so that they can do investigative reporting easier. We create data centers, we help them develop, and that's a way to make money too, to have an independent income. Of course, ours is like small compared to the donations, but still it keeps us It keeps us with the best thing about the competition, the old way, which is to keep on your toes, you say in English, or to be entrepreneurial and inventing, and that's super good about the old model. And I think that combined with foundation money and independent sort of donations, that's something really good. Now, if you're a local media, that's because Clip works in this huge space that's very difficult to have a model like ProPublica in which people, individuals, either subscribe or give money to these outlets, I think. But if you're a local outlet, you have to build a community and build that trust. And that the only way is to do it through participation, including that audience into your stories, let them participate in those stories. And I think then people start giving money. I think I've seen amazing models of investigative journalism. I'm always thinking about the Korean News Dapa, the Korean Center for Investigative Journalists. I think they have quite a large crowd that, donates. They have some kind of a subscription model or donation model of individuals, and they have enough money to do amazing journalism.
I want to use your answer to segue to technology. As I said in the intro, it is obviously both an enabler and a frustrator of good journalism, but also of successful democracy. And maybe we need to put it into pieces, and social media in particular, at its worst, is no more than bad graffiti. At its best, as you just implied, it's community-sourced and shared information, which in theory, at least, is enriched by the transparency of the medium. As a journalist, you've just said how you want to think about it. You want journalism to be connected to the community it's serving. Does that work? Or perhaps how does that work?
It's difficult. It's not a given. It's not an easy thing. We all come with their own minds, frames of mind or mindsets about we are here, we inform, there's the audience, they listen, and we are not used to audiences that produce information. So we need to figure out a way on how to include them. So it's not easy. In terms of investigative journalism, I think the best thing would be is to have, like, if you have a large amount of data on your followers or the people who like your work or people who follow you in the social media, to be able to segment those audiences. And when you want to know more about a specific case of corruption, or you're doing a story about lithium, or you're doing a story that requires a lot of expertise, you can call on that audience, and you already know who in that audience knows about these topics, or who's an expert on a given country, or on a given town, or on a given, and you incorporate them into your story and you work with them. And I think that's a way that you start really creating this sort of collective production, which I think is where we are going as where information is going as we are going as journalists. If we are standing back and saying we know it all, I think we're going to find ourselves completely distrusted and isolated. I don't know if I answered your question, because it's a difficult one and we've been looking and searching, finding avenues.
Let me push a little further, because one of the problems I see as a consumer of journalism, I consume a massive amount of journalism from around the world. And the biggest problem as a consumer is fact-checking. And I have the distinct sense, maybe fear, that fact-checking is considered old school, that it's not something that is done with the rigor that it used to be done. And I would have thought the internet would have made fact-checking easier. It seems to be making it harder. But you live in the world. Am I completely wrong about fact-checking?
No, you're right. I do think that there's a lot of information coming out there without fact-checking, and a lot of it comes from the social networks, and it's not even checked, not even nothing, not even taken with a little bit of distance. But I do think that we have the opportunity, like you said, internet can be a blessing too. Never before have we had so much information that's open to be able to verify. So we are obsessed with teaching people, teaching journalists how to verify, how to use open sources to investigate and to find truths and to get closer to truths. And I think that's really a blessing. I'll have the hope, and maybe it's my hope, that people somehow with time will see which information really passes the test of many years reading something and not letting you down. I don't know if it have happened to you, maybe, that, you've been reading somebody or something or some media and internet and you think they're great. And then you read something that you really know about and you see all the flaws. And then you start to say, it's not so good. and I think that's something that if you find a media that doesn't let you down, or even a columnist or an investigator, then that sort of sticks. And I think in the long run, that's how all these media outlets that are now so prestigious, and yet they don't have hundreds of years. They have maybe 10 years, 15 years. No, and they are very believed. Now I'm thinking about, ProPublica, and I'm thinking about Bellingcat, and I'm thinking about other journalists that are doing amazing journalism in the digital world, and they started 10 years ago, and they have a credibility of a New York Times, no?
Well, it's interesting that the names you mentioned and are thinking of aren't the New York Times or aren't Le Monde or aren't the well-established media, in not just print media, but other kinds of media. It is the new media that maybe is more trustworthy because they're coming from some different place and they've thought differently about these issues of information and disinformation and even truthiness or truth or whatever. I worry about the word truth. It bugs me a lot because I don't.
Yeah. I know.
Like that
I always talk about getting closer to truths.
And I like the plural, by the way, because there isn't. As soon as you say there's a truth, oh my God, we're in trouble. As a non-journalist, though, I'm surprised at people's obsession with misinformation and disinformation as though it's new. I mean, famously, remember the Maine. The United States goes to war with Spain over something that didn't happen, which wasn't the first time in our history or the last time in our history. But we seem to think this is a new phenomenon. And you even said it earlier that in terms of politics, We know there's a lot of bad actors spewing both mis and disinformation, two different things. Although, again, I would argue that's not terribly new. Why are we more obsessed with it today?
I think it's because it's much more pervasive, because it lives with us all the time. It's not like we know about a news that's being manipulated by a government. Yeah. And when it came from the government, let's say, Russia under Stalin or something like that, they probably controlled every information. There was people knew that official information was not free. And so people, when they are under dictatorships, they become incredibly mistrustful of information because they know everything is being set up by a power. But now that's not visible. That's not true. People don't know that. So you hear these lies over and over repeated by people, and there are narratives. For example, there is a narrative that we studied in Latin America that it comes a lot from Vox, the party in Spain, and also from the extreme right in the US. And it's this narrative that there are, if they lose an election, then there was a fraud. It was a fraudulent election. And you can see it, of course, in the US, very big, in Brazil, very big, and everywhere. They start to talk about the fraudulent elections even before. And people don't realize, because it's not that the candidate that loses says that. Probably they say that, but they believe there's tons of people who believe that. And it's all fraudulent. It's majorities created in a fraudulent way. I think that makes it more difficult to differentiate what's truth and at least what's real and what's not. And then the other thing is that it's your neighbor, your friend, you're in a WhatsApp group. It's your mother that shares it. It's your schoolmate that shares it. So you tend to believe it. You have your guard down. It's not as if the government is telling you something. It's like, it's like easy to fall into those categories, to fall into these traps. You see a lot of it all the time, no?
Which is the danger zone for democracy. It seems to me that it is that lack of trust, that willingness to trust those whom you know, which is what you said. I don't know that official over there, but I know my neighbor, I know my wife, I know my friend. And if they tell me something's true, I'm at least biased towards accepting that. But if that official or maybe that journalist and the more that happens, aren't we ending up in some very bad places in terms of how our societies function?
Yeah, I do think so. And also, I think the other big danger to democracy that's happening now, it's that supposedly people hear different versions of what's happening. Now, since John Stuart Mill and all of these, the theory says you have to have free information because then you choose whatever you want. You feel it's true, but then the problem is when you have these artificial, massive opinions. So when you see, I saw a study, for example, I think it was in Europe, done during COVID, in which I don't remember the exact number, but it was something like 75% or 80% of the information about COVID that went through the networks, so social networks in a certain number of countries in Europe, it was all created with a purpose, by bots or by bad actors. So you say, this is like too scary, because you get the impression everybody thinks that. No, it's just 3 people, but you think it's a lot of people. And then then it becomes real. We just did something in Dominican Republic. There is a very extreme fascist party, tiny little party, and it has been there for years and years and years. And, it was just among a little group of people, and that was that. With the social networks, they started to create all these, presence. They became very good at being at the social networks and pushing information and fear-mongering and all the things they know how to do. And then the other political parties started to feel they were so big that they needed to give them a space in the how do you say that? They needed to have a space as a candidate in their list for the Senate or the list for the Assembly. And that's how they gained more and more power. And when we told that story, together with a local partner, there were quite a big mass going to protest in front of the local newspaper that was our partner, because they believed they were being, harassed and whatnot. And this is how a fascist little tiny thing all of a sudden becomes a big thing. And because they make believe they're big. And then everybody treats them as a big group. No?
You've just touched on one of my pet peeves when I read or hear someone say the internet, social media exploded over this. We have no idea what that means, because what matters is the denominator. That is to say, how many people are there? How many tweets are there? And if there's 1,000 tweets, but the universe is 1 billion, the internet didn't explode. But shorthand for too many journalists they've become, and you exactly said it, they take what they see in social media as a fact and then manufacture more facts based on that. So you go down this rabbit hole where it just exaggerates the phenomenon and produces bad outcomes. How do we stop it? Who stops it? Is it censorship? Do we need the governments to intervene? Which I even hate to say, although there's more and more talk, as you know, in more and more places, that government should decide what is acceptable. Doesn't it scare you?
Yeah, that sounds very scary. I wouldn't want the government to say what's acceptable, but I would want the government to make rules of the game, to make them much more transparent, so I know how they're moderated, what kind of content they take down without telling us. To make it more transparent and not so without competition, so concrete. I mean, if Google takes down your story, what do? We did a story about this new way in which bad actors manage to take down good stories. So they go and say it's a copy. They create a blog with a previous date, and then they say it's a copy. And so they go for copyright law. They go to the Google and they say, look, Google, this guy's copied me. And it's actually a guy who's been denounced for corruption in a newspaper that's completely legitimate, and Google takes down the legitimate version because they get a thing saying, yeah, this seems to be a copy. How do you defend yourself from that? It's very difficult because these monsters are too big, the platforms. So you need to somehow regulate is how they operate, not the content. I don't want the government to say this is right or a judge or anything else. You want that freedom, but you want also some rules of the game so that people know how they work, how they privilege some information against other, how they take down information, how they do not take down information. We are just finishing a huge database on the elections of Latin America, showing those who violated the local laws of not publication on elections. Just before the election, there's laws that say you cannot publish anymore about the elections in the last 5 days or 10 days, whatever. And I don't know how many Facebook ads were published during that time of, no publication time. And they didn't care. What do governments do with Meta, which is huge? So I don't have a solution. I just think that we have to make people more and more aware that this is happening because people don't realize. No?
I think maybe, María Teresa, we have to end there because I don't have a solution either. I think we've identified more problems than answers. But obviously you're operating successfully in a space that's terrifically important, becomes more rather than less important with time, and becomes more difficult with time. We need good journalists. We need good journalism. I'm afraid we're getting less and less of both. And that's that is the conundrum of democracy in the 21st century.
Yes, I totally agree. Alan, thank you for this amazing talk. I could have gone on forever because it's a topic that, as you can see, makes me very emocionada, it moves me a lot. Yeah.
Well, thank you for the conversation, and we'll do it again sometime. Thank you. Thank you for listening to this episode of New Thinking for a New World. I'm Alan Stoga, podcast host, and I look forward to your joining our next conversation. Remember, tell us what you think at telbergfoundation.org.